He had been then crucified, and then he was speared in the side. And what we have here is an accurate depiction, forensically accurate, of a crucified man, exactly as the gospel accounts of Jesus.
So far, so good. Over 1,000 tests later, the research team had determined that this was very possibly the true burial shroud of Jesus. The whole world was abuzz with the talk of the Shroud of Turin and what it might mean if we finally had real, physical, undisputable scientific proof of the crucifixion. But then something happened to throw the whole question into doubt again.
Probably the most important scientific test that was performed on the Shroud of Turin after our examination of the cloth in 1978 was the carbon-14 or radiocarbon dating that was performed on the shroud in 1988, 10 years later. Interestingly enough, there was a 2-hour debate as they stood over the shroud as to where to take this single sample from. And ultimately, it was decided to take it from a corner of the shroud, far away from the image and the other bloodstains and things on the shroud, but not far from a water stain and a scorch, but down in this corner, right next to an existing seam, so it would appear that this was authentic Shroud of Turin. Although in our photographs of 1978, even the regular white light photographs, there was a different color in that area, but we weren't really that concerned about that part of the shroud since we weren't thinking about radiocarbon dating in 78. So we didn't pay much attention to that corner. In 88, that's the corner they sampled from. They took a piece, they cut it into thirds, and each was distributed to the 3 laboratories that remained involved in the testing here. So they took their sample, they did their testing, they came out with their results, which was a medieval date, 1260 to 1390, I believe, and they, with much fanfare, went up on the television and media, and the world headlines were "Shroud is a fake."
Sounds familiar? The common answer of the doubting Thomases these days, when faced with the questions of the Shroud of Turin, is to bring up the carbon dating. 3 different teams of scientists tested a piece of the shroud and found that it was only 700 years old. It couldn't possibly have been the burial shroud of Christ. You can't argue with that. It's science. Well, you know what? We agree. And the original Shroud research team agree. And for a while it left them completely puzzled.
So at the end of this period of 1988, when the results were announced, those of us involved with the study of the shroud from a truly scientific point of view were left scratching our heads and wondering, how could this be?
In fact, the answer was right in front of their eyes, or had been all those years ago, when the team had a discussion about which part of the shroud to take for carbon dating.
Interestingly enough, there was a 2-hour debate as they stood over the shroud as to where to take this single sample from. And ultimately, it was decided to take it from a corner of the shroud. They went away. None of them performed the chemical analysis that was called for by their own protocol, and when they were asked why, the response was, well, we knew which sample the shroud was, so we didn't need to do the chemical analysis.
None of the 3 teams entrusted with carbon dating the shroud sample followed their own protocol to make sure there was nothing wrong or unusual about the piece of the shroud they had chosen for their tests. At the time, and when news of the test results hit newsstands around the world, nobody knew whether this oversight would have made any difference. But one man was determined to find out. Born in Albuquerque, New Mexico, Ray Rogers was an explosives research expert and thermal analyst with the Los Alamos Scientific Laboratory for over 30 years before serving on the department of the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board, where he held the equivalent rank of Lieutenant General and earned a Distinguished Service Award. Ray Rogers wasn't just a scientist, He was one of America's finest. He was also part of the original Shroud of Turin research team in 1978.
Ray Rogers readdressed the shroud. He was ill and his time was coming to pass away, and he knew that he hadn't really completed what he had begun. And so Ray decided that he would revisit this issue of the shroud. And one of the first things that prompted him to do so was a paper that was published in 2000 by Joe Marino and Sue Benford that claimed that the corner from which the radiocarbon sample had been taken was in fact a rewoven, patched, or repaired corner. Rogers saw their paper and called me up and said, look, I'm going to prove these people wrong, and it's only going to take me 5 minutes. And I said, fine, Ray, you do what you have to do. I mean, he was a scientist and wasn't asking my permission anyway. Ray told me afterwards that he spent about 1 hour examining samples that he had from that very same corner where the carbon dating sample had been removed. And he said after 1 hour, he found that Benford and Marino were correct, that he was wrong, and there was evidence that this corner was anomalous. Now, remembering that Ray Rogers is a chemist, Ray took his sample and he performed a chemical analysis and a microscopic analysis. What the microscope revealed was a gummy substance on the surface of the fibers in this corner. When he did the chemical analysis of the gummy substance, he found that it was gum arabic, and when he looked inside the gum arabic under the microscope, he found little particles of a dye that came from the madder root plant.
This was a strange discovery which on its own offered no real answers about how the radiocarbon dating could have produced such a strange result. But there was more.
The other thing he found that was very unique was cotton interwoven with the linen itself, and there was no cotton found anywhere else interwoven into the fibers of the shroud linen. So this made it unique. Well, this changed everything. And consequently, Ray found a splice in one of his samples. He actually found an end-to-end splice. And so this is not found in the rest of the shroud. One can look at the transmitted light photographs that I made, light passing through the shroud, and in many places you can see where at the end of a piece of yarn, a hank of yarn, when they had to attach a new hank of yarn, they just laid one literally right on top of the other and slammed down the loom device and kept on weaving. There were no splices found elsewhere in the shroud, but there is a splice in this corner. Now, to be certain that he was correct, because Ray was a really empirical scientist, Ray Rogers obtained a reserve piece of the actual sample cut for radiocarbon dating back in 1988 from the Turin authorities. So he obtained this sample and he performed the same chemical analysis on this and found exactly the same thing. So we now know that this sample, this corner of the shroud, is anomalous and is not the same as the rest of the shroud.
Remember that when Ray Rogers decided to undertake this new test, he didn't believe that the corner of the shroud could have been rewoven or in any way tampered with. The people who were suggesting as much, their theory was ridiculous, he said. They weren't scientists, he said. He was going to prove them wrong in 5 minutes, he said. Instead, it took Ray Rogers just 5 minutes to undermine the single biggest doubt cast upon the authenticity of the shroud.
Now, this is extremely important, obviously, from a radiocarbon dating point of view, because if there's a rewoven section that was done somewhere in medieval times, well then, by all means, that would yield a different radiocarbon date than some of the shroud that was not manipulated elsewhere on the cloth. So had more than one sample been taken, perhaps we would have had some indication right away that there was a discrepancy between this corner and the rest of the cloth, but because that was the only sample taken, everybody drew their conclusions virtually from a single sample. And although 3 different labs tested it, they all tested the same sample, so it was really only one test done 3 times, not 3 different tests, because they all used the same AMS radiocarbon dating technique.
It's important to keep in mind the backgrounds of Ray Rogers and Barry Schwartz. Ray, one of the world's top chemists, a skeptic who refused to believe until he carried out an experiment for himself that the radiocarbon dating could have been flawed. Barry, also a skeptic when he joined the Shroud research team, a Jewish man investigating a Christian relic. These guys placed their absolute faith in science and in facts, and spoke only the truth as they saw it with their own eyes. They had no hidden agendas. But were there others involved in the Shroud research who did have their own agendas? It's an interesting question.
Those who speak on their own authority are trying to gain glory for themselves. But he who wants glory for the one who sent him is honest, and there is nothing false in him.